Today we're at Code Stock, and my guest is Charles Petzold. Sir, how are you?
Good, good.
It's an honor to meet you.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed your keynote last night.
Thank you.
You talked about sort of combining history and
it was
science and
I suspect a little unusual. It was on a pet topic, favorite topic of mine, which is a tide predicting machine that was invented by William Thompson, also known as Lord Kelvin, in the 1860s and 1870s, and how it came about. So I threw in a bunch of little history of how people progressively understood the tides, how the tides worked over history, and then how the need came about for better ways of predicting the tides, and William Thompson decided to apply harmonic analysis to it, which was, he was a big fan of Joseph Fourier's book on the Fourier transform, among other things, and was able to apply harmonic analysis to tidal readings, and then build a machine that reconstituted all the sine curves and plotted out the tides for the future.
So it's a computer.
It's a computer. It's a early, almost analog computer. Yes, even though analog computers were always very specific in what they did. They are not general purpose computers, but conceivably, this particular analog computer, this design, could be applied anywhere you needed to sum up sine curves in a Fourier transform. So I guess it's a little generalized at that point.
And you said, you mentioned during your talk that you were considering expanding this into a book.
Yes, I've been.
Several historical
yes,
books.
I've been. This book project has been. In fact, a few years ago, I wrote a few chapters of it, and I just wasn't happy with the chapters. They were a little too technical, and I've been, because it's an odd kind of book. It has to combine a lot of history, and there has to be some technology in it. I'm not sure how much, and it also involves a interesting conflict during the 19th century about how old the Earth was exactly, or even approximately, because Charles Darwin and the evolutionists relied upon the existence of a very old Earth for evolution to occur, because it requires a long time and very gradual processes over a period of time, whereas William Thompson, Lord Kelvin, as a physicist, believed that he could estimate how old the Earth was by analyzing Earth as a cooling ball, and he came out with a much shorter estimate of the age of the Earth. So there was this controversy, and part of his investigation into the tides was to resolve this controversy, to figure out if perhaps tides were causing a slowing down of the Earth's rotation, hence the Earth was more chaotic in past years, and so it appeared that it was older than it actually was. So there's a lot of stuff in there, and when I started writing this book a few years ago, I was focusing a lot on the technology and the math and the science, and I knew it wasn't working. And
yeah, so that's important, but the interesting part is the conflict.
Yeah, and recently I have come to realize that in reading a few books that I've really enjoyed, that involve that history and particularly history of science, have focused on the people.
Yes.
There was one book I read about a year or so ago called Age of Wonder, which was about science during the late 1700s, early 1800s, what is called the Romantic Era. And each chapter was focused on an individual, and you kind of fleshed them out. You got, with a lot of trivial stuff too, but you got to know these people and so understand their role in this history. So I think that it's finally dawning on me that to do a book that involves history, really focus on the people.
Yeah, they call it the great man theory.
Yeah.
Even
though a lot of them aren't really great men.
Yeah, I'll put finger quotes around the word great, but the influential men, and then that impacted it.
Yeah, because many of the people I'd like to discuss in this book would be classified great men. I think Isaac Newton, easily.
He's pretty
Lord Kelvin himself, even though he had a few flaws. Charles Lyell, who wrote some very influential books on geology in the 1830s. Charles Darwin. But one of the things that this book has to discuss is how particularly discoveries in geology cause people to reevaluate how old the Earth was. And this really occurred between about 1750 and 1850, so it's a whole century there. And in 1750, most people thought the Earth was several thousand years old.
Yeah, they just did the math in the Bible.
Yeah. And by 1850, even though they didn't necessarily have to believe in it, you know, literally, but there was a strong tradition that the Earth was just not that old.
Mm-hmm.
And by 1850, however, every well-read person and every scientist believed that the Earth was millions of years old. So what happened in between this period? Well, you had a lot of geologists marching through. But when did the actual, when was the tipping point? And I want to try to make the argument that the tipping point was actually occurred in 1785. And the reason why is that there was this English poet who's very well known, almost forgotten now, named William Cowper. His last name is actually spelled Cowper, C-O-W-P-E-R. And he wrote this book called The Task. It was a long poem. It was a book-length poem called The Task. And within this poem, there are 5 lines that I wish I could quote off the top of my head about how geologists are tapping at rocks and doubting that the world is older than what Moses said it was. So in 1785, things had gotten to a point where an English evangelical poet could be nervous that the geologists were picking away at his beliefs.
The poem made the change, but the fact that he recognized the change was occurring was significant.
Yes, and he obviously, the poems have a little bit the poem has a little bit of humor to it, but also a little bit of nervousness. So I would love to peg that chapter about this geological revolution to William Cowper, for example. And
Mm-hmm.
it's odd, but it's what makes the book what might make the book more interesting to people who are not necessarily interested in the history of analog computing, and what would make it more readable, and what, of course, would make it more challenging to me as an author.
Sure, yeah.
And the more challenging it is, the longer it'll take to write. So this has been a long-term book.
So I thought one of the interesting people points that he made, there was this rivalry, or I don't want to call it rivalry, there was this conflict between Charles Darwin and Lord Kelvin. Mostly about the age of the world, and yet Kelvin or Thompson hired Darwin's son as his assistant at some point. So they must have put them in too bad. It had to be some mutual respect.
Yeah, it was never personal. These people, even though they had very public debates about scientific issues, they would meet as friends in gatherings and stuff like that.
I didn't know that. So they actually were friends.
They were. Darwin was mostly a stay-at-home person, so he didn't get out much. But William Thompson knew virtually every other scientist. He was a very social person.
I see.
And he was very much involved in the British Association for the Advancement of Science was his big organization. He was there every year. This was This was a organization founded around 1844 or so, and it was held in a different city in Great Britain every year. And William Thompson almost always made a point of going. In fact, he went to the very first one when he was something like 17 years old. So, and these were big gatherings of all the scientists in Great Britain and some from overseas, and so these were great hobnobbing sessions.
Yeah, so the other point that I thought was very interesting was you pointed out some of the mistakes that people made. So Galileo, for example, he was all wrong about how the tides were produced. Thompson / Kelvin, he was wrong about the age of the Earth, ultimately, and then these people stuck with these opinions for decades, which gives hope to guys like me. These giants of science can be wrong about something and adamantly wrong about it. Maybe I have a chance. So part of my greatness of all my mistakes.
I know. William Thompson has really taken a bad hit from the historical perspective. His reputation might be a little higher today if he hadn't persisted so long for 4 decades in insisting that the Earth could not possibly be more than 50 million years old. And without really qualifying that by saying something, I may be missing something. And he was missing something. He was missing, and it's obviously because he was radium wasn't discovered until about the turn of the century, and turns out there is sufficient radium and other radioactive materials inside the surface of the Earth that contributes significantly to how warm the Earth is.
That was his
amazing,
basically his conclusions on was the temperature of the Earth. So is this how you make your living, by writing books, or are you doing consulting?
I was able to make my living writing books for a good, I don't know, 15 years or so. From about, my first book was published in 1987 called Programming Windows.
That's a classic.
Published by Microsoft Press. And the sales were slow for a few years, and then second and third editions were published in the early 90s about Windows 3 and Windows 3.1, and the sales really took off at that point. And so, for most of the 90s, and I was able to make my living writing books, and into this century as well. In recent years, it's not been possible. It's the book sales have just plummeted overall. And so in recent years I've been doing consulting. But
you're still writing. You have a book out just recently.
Yes. My most recent book is called Programming Windows Phone 7. And it is available as a free download.
Really?
It's over, is
that a Microsoft Press book?
It is a Microsoft Press book, and it was obviously, since people download it, I don't get royalties, but I was paid for it. So
it's also available as a dead tree version.
Yes, it is. So the downloadable version, it's downloadable as a PDF. It's over 1,000 pages, and it covers Windows Phone programming, both Silverlight and XNA. Unfortunately, the XNA section isn't as big as I had hoped it was going to be, but we're going to try to fix that later this year.
Well, that's the beauty of an e-book. It's updated at any time.
Yeah, you would think.
Blog readers know that.
You would think so. You would think e-books. There's still a major effort to update an e-book. Yeah, because it really has to. Once the publisher and the editors are involved and stuff like that, it's really the same as an ordinary book, except that it's not sent. The PDF file's not sent to the printer. That's the only difference. But there are print-on-demand versions available as well for this book, and surprisingly, people have been interested in buying those. I would have thought that once you put out something as an ebook, that's your nobody will buy the print version.
Well, until the Kindle, the Nook, and those devices came along, I think most people have trouble reading 1,000 pages on a computer screen. much more so than holding down your hand and flipping to a certain section. The paradigm is changing recently just because the technology is changing.
Right.
But I know that's a challenge for me anyway, maybe because I'm an old guy.
Yeah. I agree entirely with you about reading books on the computer screen. If I often find myself just printing out an HTML page or something like that.
Now you're telling my mom.
Then I can sit down on the couch and read it like that.
My mom has a stack about that tall of emails. You don't have that, do you?
No. I gave my wife a Nook for Christmas, and she enjoys reading that. I read one book on it. It was all right. I still like paper books, but where I found what really revolutionized the book reading experience for me was my Windows Phone.
Oh yeah.
I have been writing my own ebook reading software for this. Really? I'm writing about it I write articles for MSDN magazine. So there's going to be about 4 or 5 articles about this ebook reader, but it's based on, I've been basing it on books downloaded from Project Gutenberg, which they have about, they have about 35,000 books at this point, and even though they're available in different formats now, I'm just looking at plain text formats, so I don't have any italics or bolds or headings or anything like that, and just formatting them, paginating them in pages so I can flip through the pages like that. And just and it's mostly novels, of course, so I don't want to read anything technical on the phone, but just the convenience of anywhere I am, pulling the phone out of my pocket, reading a few pages, putting the phone away, back in my pocket.
So this is why you're waiting for the subway to come?
Anything, any place. Any place. Except when the plane's taking off, then you can't do it. But that has really made me think that maybe there's something to this ebook business after all, when you can carry it in your pocket. Because I like to travel light. And that's great for me. And even though the screen's small, it's very crisp and it's very readable. And so that's how I've been reading some fiction recently, at least public domain fiction.
Outstanding. So is the ebook reader that you're writing, is that available to the rest of us?
I'm eventually going to put it on the marketplace for free.
Okay.
But the articles haven't gotten to the point yet. I've been doing all kinds of different issues involving. I'm trying to make it generalized enough for anybody who needs to display text on Windows Phone, of paginating it, and which is a trick in itself in Silverlight, and doing very fast pagination and transitions between pages, how you like pages to flip over, you like pages to slide, you like pages to curl, you like pages to skew. Well, I'm doing them all. So once you have this page on the phone, suppose you want to select some text for looking it up in Wikipedia or something. You don't need to look up a word or define a word, look it up in a dictionary. Well, the text is so small and your finger is so big, it's hard to select text like that. So of course you want to have a pinch interface. Expand the text and then select it, and then little menus pop up. So all those issues
started out as a small thing.
Yes, all those issues are being covered in the magazine articles, and then they're all going to come together in a real program. So.
Excellent. Well, Charles Petzold, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.